The recording started. So our speaker this morning is Ann Lovejoy. The last time she presented some information on growing tomatoes. And so now, since the weather's getting drier, we're going to talk about how to maintain your garden when there's less rainfall, and also things you can do to introduce other vegetables into your garden. And also, I think one of the things you're going to talk about is maintaining hanging baskets and flower pots and that sort of thing, correct?
Yep, you got it. And you know, it's okay to ask me questions about tomatoes. Just because we did it once doesn't mean it's the end of that topic. And I know a lot of people are still wondering about what's going on with them. With these cold nights we've been having, they're really not that happy. Tomatoes, beans, peppers, eggplants, all of them are tropical plants that really prefer temperatures over 55. And if you look at your phone, it tells you night temperatures as well as day temperatures. So soil temperatures follow night temperatures. So it can be 80 degrees in the day, which it hasn't. But if it's a 51 at night, that means your soil temp is still down in those 50s. And tomatoes are going to get yellowy and not look very happy about it. Same with some of the peppers and things like that. It actually checks their growth a little bit. And the thing about annual crops is if their growth is checked, they don't always recover very well because they just have one life to live. Isn't that a soap opera name? I believe it is. So one life to live means if somewhere along that line you don't get enough water or fertilizer or sun or shade or whatever that is, that crop may not snap back. So staying on it is a little different. Perennials are much more forgiving because they can get their toes way down into the soil and tap into all the nutrients and stored water that are in our heavy clay soils. But annuals don't really have that ability, especially if they're in containers or something. So that's why their care is a little different and a little fussier than for perennial plants. Though tomatoes are actually perennial, and where they are native, which is mostly South and Central America, they can grow for years and become humongous, gigantic plants. And you can carry them over in a little greenhouse for a while anyway. I've picked tomatoes myself well into wintertime, December and beyond, because of having an unheated sunroom at the time. Sheila, did you want to ask me something about seawater?
Yeah, I'm talking and it was muted. It's a little hard to do something when you're muted. Anyway, yeah, just mention that you had mentioned last time about using a quart of seawater, and I just thought it would bear repeating.
It's true. A lot of people don't know this, but there was research done years ago now, good 10, 15 years ago. New Jersey had always been kind of one of the main places in the United Eastern Seaboard for growing tomatoes. And the tomatoes started not tasting very good. And the growers couldn't figure out why. And they finally kind of figured out with some research from Cornell University that it was because they were growing the same crops over and over and over and depleting the nutrients in the soil. And the main ingredient that was missing was salt. So table salt isn't quite the answer, but sea salt, which is full of minerals, is super helpful to tomatoes. It gives them back their flavor. It restores the flavor balance. So they figured out a giant program for growers, but what it works out to be for people like us with backyard plants is about 1 quart per plant one time in the growing cycle. And so usually I put that on when they start setting fruit, which for me is right about now. They're still flowering pretty heavily. And this is when, if you water each plant well, because you never want to put anything that has nutrients in it on a dry plant, water well, wait half an hour or so, and then give each plant a quart of seawater, and you can get it right out of the harbor, of course. Or, I mean, there are now sort of artificial seawater formulas, but really, we got it. We might as well use it. It's kind of great. There are a number of things that boost flavor in vegetables, and one of the biggest ones is called bricks, natural sugars that occur in all kinds of things from turnips to cherries, right? And the more bricks you have, the better something tastes. And that's even true for turnips. It's not going to make them taste like a raspberry, but it will make them taste less like sweaty sweat, old sweat socks. They can have a nasty flavor. Carrots can be very bitter. But if there's enough bricks in the soil, you'll find all your vegetables have a lot more full flavor and a good flavor balance. And the way you do that is by mulching with compost, with mature compost. And actually, weirdly enough, Safeway has bagged compost right now from Carpintero Brothers. And I think it must have a little fish fertilizer or something in there because it is boomtown. But if you mulch the tops of your tomatoes with some of that Carpintero's organic compost from Safeway, which I never thought I'd be saying, but you know, a lot of us just have a few plants. You don't need to get a whole truckload, but you'd be really quite impressed with what happens to your plants.
And would that last over a period of a year or two?
Not two. Compost, you know, degrades fairly quickly.
I meant the bag.
The bag?
The stuff that's in the bag.
Well, that same thing will hold true. Like if you've had a bag for a couple of years, it's now museum quality, but it's not really active anymore. Like all those biota that are in the bag start to die off, especially, you know, plastic doesn't breathe very well. Usually there's got a few breathing holes, but it will get compressed. If it gets rained on, it will get wet. That will start the degradation process even more. So it's better to buy a bag and share it with a friend if you can't use it all. But keeping compost around, whether bagged or in a big heap, is kind of pointless. It works better. It's like so many things. It works better if you use it. Like when we have remedies on the shelf and they just stay on the shelf and you can't figure out why it doesn't work. Well, you got to put it to use, right? So old compost is good to put on in your compost heap and keep it rotating. One of the things you can also do with that nice compost is put it in your hanging baskets. I was saying earlier that they start to get a little shaggy looking around now. And so one of the things you have to do with them is pinch them back. Pinch back the flowers that are turning brown or falling off. You do not want them to set seed, because when annuals set seed, they feel like their mission is fulfilled and they stop trying to bloom. So setting seed ensures the next generation, or so they hope. And so that's their true task, not to make summer beautiful for you or me. So what they want to do is rush through to their, you know, ultimate mission, and we want to slow them down. So you don't want to put a lot of high number fertilizers on annuals. For one thing, if you dump something with a lot of nitrogen in it, that goes right to leaf instead of to fruit or flower. And with annuals, most of us are growing them for the flowers. And so you want to either a balanced, maybe like a 10-10-10, or even for a hanging basket that gets watered a lot, I would use like a Peters 20-20-20, which I would never use for something in the ground. But again, a hanging basket or a color bowl, they don't have access to the nutrients in the soil. So they're stuck on whatever you're going to give them. So always water first, and then go ahead and give them a dose every 10 days to 2 weeks of some kind of fertilizer. The reason that you have to do it that often is because every time you water a plant, the nutrients in those chemical fertilizers get washed away. With compost in the soil, it's a little different, because it's true that every time you water, some of the compost nutrients will get washed into the soil, but they don't move that fast. And so they're held in the soil, locked in by biota, and they're available to your plants for a lot longer. Does that make sense? I see at least Karen's getting my picture here. So feeding every 10 days to 2 weeks, plants that are dependent on us will really help. And if you get those big wave petunias or things like that, and they're getting so they only bloom at the ends and they get kind of bloomed out, you can give them a good sharp haircut. That's legal. You'd have to do it outside with a mask on, but you could still give them a haircut. And then water them well and give them some fertilizer. And within a week or two, you'll start to see new growth budding up again. I did want to mention that it can be really difficult to re-wet plants in hanging baskets and in some of those color bowls or smaller pots and containers, especially if the compost or the potting soil you're using has a lot of peat moss in it. Peat actually has zero nutrient value, none whatsoever. It's not environmentally sound. It's mined, literally destroying ecological, beautiful, sensitive sites that are bogs. And it doesn't really contribute anything. But the worst of it for me is that it dries out and it becomes almost impossible to re-wet. In nurseries, they use wetting agents, sticking agents like a surfactant to help keep them open enough that you can add water. And they have automatic irrigation systems that deliver water on an absolutely regular basis. We don't have that. So you have this that you're watering a pot and it just seems to all run out. What usually happens is the soil has dried out and it's shrinking away from the side of the pot. And so instead of getting absorbed by the soil, it's just running straight out of the sides. So there's two things you can do about that. And one is to have a great big saucer, a big deep saucer, and put that plant in the saucer before you water it, and the water will be captured and then slowly absorbed from the bottom, which is a really good way to water a lot of things. With hanging baskets, that can be a little tricky because some of them are planted on the sides and the bottom all the way around, and it's like you can't set it down. So I've actually put them on a children's wading pool full of water, and I put a ladder over it and hang the basket off the ladder so that it just about the bottom third is submerged. I know that sounds weird, but you can do that for about an hour and it won't hurt those bottom plants, and it will make that potting soil absorb again, and it will start pulling up from the bottom. Also, if you do add compost, that Carpintero compost I was talking about, sprinkle a little bit of that on, not a lot, but if you put on a ½ inch of that and water, that will actually be like an active fertilizer, and it will hold the moisture better than the soil, which a lot of times by now, the soil is so full of roots, there's hardly really any soil left.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry, can you repeat it?
Yeah. I think I've got an echo going, but I don't know why. But anyway, all right. So my son-in-law has a wonderful compost pile. Wonderful. That's been happy for quite a while, but it's doing its thing. The chickens love it. The thing is that I wondered if about getting a bag of that they could bring that to me, and I could just put like a cup on my tomato. I'm back to my tomato plant. On the tomato plant every 2 or 3 weeks or so.
Well, here's the thing about compost. If a pile is hot, a working pile, it's still full of biological degraders, which is the biota that lives in the soil. And when compost is in the active phase, like steamy, you'll get a lot of degraders in there. And one of the things they eat is roots. And so if you put hot compost on a plant, it's going to go down, and those degraders will start working happily, gratefully on the roots of whatever you just put it on. So you want compost that's no longer hot, but is not inert. Like I said earlier, if it's been sitting in a bag for 2 years, its life is over. Basically, it's just a soil conditioner at this point, which is not terrible, but it's not nutritive. So if they could sift some out for you, and I usually rub it through a window screen into a wheelbarrow or something like that to get the big lumps out, because in pots and containers, big coarse compost is kind of awkward to work with. But if they can sieve it out for you and let it sit around for a couple weeks till it cools down, then it's perfect. And instead of doing that every week, just go ahead and put an inch on your pot, and then you'll still have to be feeding it because, again, it doesn't have access to the soil nutrients. And once it's been watered every day, pretty much it has to be in the summer, you're going to need to supplement with some kind of fertilizer. Does that make sense?
Right. And what fertilizer is it that you always talk about? I keep forgetting.
Well, for like I said, stuff in the ground is different. When we have access to a garden, I do mulch mostly with compost or composted cow manure, dairy manure, not steer manure, because they're fed a lot of salt. But for pots and containers, in the summer, I do cave and use part of, the chemical fertilizers like a Peters 20-20-20 for a hanging basket of petunias. That's going to do the trick. Whereas a very mild, like the kind of organic fertilizer that you scratch into the soil, it doesn't act fast enough to be helpful to that annual that's trying to put on a big boom of color. Does that make sense?
So I'm asking about particularly about a tomato in a pot in a container on my porch.
Well, you could use that 20-20-20, or I mean, truthfully, what I do is I mix up my own crazy looking stuff, which is I take a gallon jug and put in about a tablespoon of seaweed extract, liquid seaweed, which has all those sea salt minerals and things in it, and about a teaspoon of liquid humic acid, which is something that is one of the principal ingredients in compost that activates soil. Excuse me. And then I will put in a tablespoon probably of that, like a Peter's liquid fertilizer 20-20-20 for summer plants like tomatoes, peppers, beans, that kind of stuff. And water the plant really well and give it about a quarter cup of my elixir. And that works really, really well. But if you don't want to be bothered with all that, which most people don't, you can just go ahead and follow the directions on like a Peters or even a Miracle Grow 20-20-20. They're pretty similar. I do like to splash a little liquid kelp or seaweed extract, because kelp is really the fastest growing plant on the planet. And one of the things it does is strengthen cell walls. So with all the wind we've been having, plants are getting kind of floppy and they get blown around. If you can give them a little booster of diluted kelp, it actually helps them have stronger stems and denser foliage. And denser foliage is less susceptible to diseases of all kinds. So it's like bolstering your plant's immune system.
Yeah, and you had mentioned a long time ago about not using those little pellets, which of course I bought the whole thing of, Thanks a lot.
Sorry, Sheila, but here's the deal. Pelletized fertilizers they're not optimal for our part of the Maritime Northwest. And here's why. They're not activated until the soil temperature reaches the 70s. Well, now you think about this. If our night temperatures are still in the 50s, that means the soil temperature has a long way to go. On the other hand, when we get that one day in May that always happens when it goes shooting up into the 80s, a lot of times what will happen is that pelletized stuff will dump all at once, a huge amount, and burn the crap out of whatever it was we were trying to feed. So that's not really very effective. And the other flip side of that is that there are summers when our soil temperatures never do hit the 70s. And right now, this looks like being one of them, though that, of course, could change. Our weather here is really tricky. If you look at the maps put out by NOAA that are for our region, the markers are all the color that says 50-50. In other words, it could be warmer or cooler. It could be hotter. It could be drier or wetter. 50-50. Thanks. That's just so not helpful. But that's what we have. So, I'm thinking you can't rely. How many times have we seen the phone saying, oh yeah, it's going to rain tomorrow, and it doesn't? Or yeah, it's going to shoot up and be really hot, but another cold pressure area moves in and it's gray and cool again. You just don't know. One thing I have done is I have caged all my tomatoes, and I put a plastic bag with the bottom cut off, and I tie that around the cage. And that really is like a little mini greenhouse. And the top is open, of course, so it can get air and water and so forth. Well, when it gets cold at night, I tape those suckers back on. It's sort of a bother, but I'd rather have them warmed up in the night than keep going up, down, up, down, up, down, which is really hard on any plant, just like it is on us. So keeping things going is always wise. Now, that could have an effect on the soil temperature too, in which case maybe that pelletized fertilizer would be more useful, but I wouldn't bet on it. Because it's so out of our hands, I'd rather do something that I have better control over. Does that make sense? You should tell me if you want the short answer anytime. Who else? Megan, do you have a question?
We have a compost pile, and I actually just finished sifting a huge pile of dirt. And but Jonathan, my partner, was saying that it was too acidic. What would you do about that?
Gosh, that's very unusual. Compost is almost always close to neutral. So I'm guessing if you're, now the soil could be acidic for sure, because soil around here, almost by definition, is going to be acidic. And for all of your native plants, doesn't matter at all. If you're trying to grow vegetables, it does, because most vegetables prefer close to neutral. So compost, being neutral almost invariably, is the usual buffering agent. So instead of trying to, I mean, you can lime, but that will take 4 to 5 years before the lime actually has enough of an effect to shift your soil pH. But if you can mulch with compost twice a year, that will be a quicker fix. And of course, it improves the soil texture as well and promotes the growth of all the soil biota, the creatures that are in the soil that bring it to life. And having a lively, active soil is really more useful to your plants than having it nutritionally perfect. Most of our heavy soils are actually quite nutritive, but because they're low in calcium, a lot of those nutrients get locked up. So one of the things you can do if you're seeing plants not really getting their grow on the way we'd like to see it is to give, here's another one of those, it sounds goofy, but it actually works. So you get skim milk and you dilute it to a 10% solution and spray it on your foliage, top and bottom, and you will see that they'll green up. And a lot of times the plants will take off and start growing better because the access to calcium is really a huge important factor in plant health. And here's another weird fact. The reason that we do not have land snails, native land snails here, is because of that calcium poor soil. There's literally not enough calcium in the soils for them to build their own snail shells. But California soils rich in it. And the snails and slugs we're seeing this year are insane. And a lot of that is coming up from California on plants. And in California, I had a friend in Berkeley, and I remember spending an evening there and walking around the garden at night. She's like, put your shoes on because it's horrible out there. And sure enough, crunch, 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 crunch. It's just a mess. And a lot of that was because in the gold rush, the 49ers wanted fancy champagne and wonderful meals, and they wanted to have snails imported from France. And you could still see the old stock pens for those snails in San Francisco Bay. At least 20 years ago you could. And they got out, of course. And yeah, they're slow, but they travel with plants and they travel with people and they travel with soil and bagged compost and all kinds of things. And that's our inheritance of that great European tradition. This year is really bad for slugs and snails. And the problem with controlling them is that the little teeny slugs that do the most damage do not eat bait. They are live foliage feeders, and at that stage of their life, they will only eat live foliage, which is, hello, your plants. Now, bigger snails and slugs will happily take the bait. And so if you can take something like Sluggo, which is based on iron phosphate, which is naturally occurring in almost every soil and in waters, and concentrated in bran, which is what that is, it actually paralyzes mollusks specifically. So it doesn't hurt birds. It doesn't hurt pets. It doesn't actually hurt people. But if you are a snail or a scallop or something like that, it will kill you. So obviously you don't want to use it where it could get washed into the water and do harm to aquatic life. But for slugs and snails, mature ones, you can just put a 1/4 teaspoon of this stuff right at the base of your plant. You don't need to broadcast it and scatter it all over the place. That's when you're feeding the birds. Slugs have to climb to get up in there. They don't fly. So if you put the spade exactly at the base of the plant, that's where they will get picked up by your slugs or snails. They will dry up very quickly, just within a day or two. And apparently, supposedly, it's not a painful death like pouring salt on them or something like that, or spraying them with ammonia. That's mean. We don't need to be mean.
Yeah, I had a question. I'm sorry, I got an echo, but if you could go back to what you were saying about the calcium solution, how do you know when you've diluted milk to the point where you have a 10% solution?
Well, if you think about, you could do it. You don't need to fill up that gallon. Put a cup of skim milk and then add 10 cups of water.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it's pretty basic math. And if it wasn't exactly right on, nobody's going to give you a titer test and see if the titration is perfect. It doesn't matter. But you just want to thin it out because spraying milk on your plant isn't going to help. Though, back in the day, our pioneer grandparents, or great-grandparents probably, used to do a trick when they were growing pumpkins and squash where you'd cut a slit in the stem right before you came to the fruiting body, and they'd put it in a saucer of milk with a stone on top to keep it absorbed, and it would absorb the calcium through the stem and make a much bigger pumpkin or squash or whatever it was, and with a nice hard shell. So that's a fun experiment if anyone wants to play. I feel like I'm getting a little afield here. Anybody got specific questions they would like answered? How about you, James? Jim Hayner, do you have anything?
Yeah, we wintered over a geranium, a really nice geranium, and we live in a condo and have a nice deck, and it gets good sun and so forth, and it wintered over beautifully, but it seems to be getting substantially larger leaves than when we bought it, and not as much bloom. And we're following your instructions and watering it regularly, and it's happy. It's very happy, but I'd like to see it burst forward with more blooms.
And hopefully when you overwinter geraniums and things like that, the one thing you've got to remember is that they're going to need to be repotted in fresh soil. And it sounds like you might have done that if it's doing that well. But again, if you do more nitrogen than it needs, you might be getting more foliage and fewer flowers. So you could look at some of those. There are some of the fertilizers would be like a 10-20-10. And maybe you'd look at some of that instead of the 20-20-20 or the 10-10-10.
Yeah, I can't remember what we're using, but we are fertilizing a fair amount, and it seems to be happy, but I see what you mean. In other words, and what is it, Catherine, the fertilizer we use? Miracle Grow. We're using Miracle Grow.
Yeah. Well, Miracle Grow has about 50 formulas, and you can buy azalea food or rhododendron, blah, 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 all these different kinds. So look for something like that says tomato food, say, because it will have a higher middle number, and that will probably get you more blossoms. The other thing with geraniums that will help is, like, as soon as those heads are spent, pinch them off.
Yes.
And that will.
We're doing that.
Yeah. And by the way, somebody was asking me recently about should they deadhead their rhododendrons, and the answer is maybe, because if you do deadhead rhododendrons on a regular basis, you're encouraging them to grow a lot larger.
Oh.
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that.
Really?
Yeah, and if they're already getting kind of on the big side, you might not want to do that. One of the things a lot of people don't realize is that there are rhododendrons, many of the older ones especially, are called arboreal forms, so they get to be small trees. And if they're in a site or specific spot that isn't really perfect for that, you might want to either put them on a good pruning regimen or switch them out, donate that one to Habitat for Humanity and get a smaller one that's going to stay the size you really want.
Hey, Ann, what do you think the forecast is for our tomatoes to actually ripen this year, even if we're using garbage bags?
How many years have we had this? This reminds me so much of back in the 80s and the early 90s when it would be gray, 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 and you'd think it was going to rain and it never did. But that marine layer is persistent, and that can really be a problem. One thing you could do to boost them is to get some red plastic mulch. It's red plastic sheeting, and actually drape it around the pot so that it reflects back, and that encourages ripening and can actually give you about 30% higher fruit set. Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that tomatoes will not set fruit under 55 degrees, and they'll start dropping flowers. And that is also true for 80. So once it gets over about 80 degrees, they'll start dropping flowers too. So if it does suddenly get super hot, you might even want to consider some shade cloth so that you're bouncing some of that heat back off them. Because again, in pots, they're so much more vulnerable than they are in the ground.
Right.
And the bigger the pot, the better it is. If you can get a hold of a tree pot, 45-gallon tree pot, for instance, that gives you a little habitat. That's enough of an ecosystem that you can kind of buffer a lot of the weather variations. But smaller pots in different situations, they're probably going to need a little more help. If it's small enough, you could even bring it in at night.
Oh, yeah.
You know, roll them in or put them inside, just tuck them in. My neighbor, who's from Siberia, she has a little shed, just a 3-sided little shed, and she put shower curtains across the 4th side, and her tomatoes grow there facing southwest. And then at night, she comes out in that late afternoon, as soon as the sun's off them, she pulls those shower curtains over, and it's like a little mini greenhouse. I think it's adorable.
That is wonderful.
Well, in Siberia, I guess you really learn your tricks because they don't have much summer. And you know, those tomatoes will ripen eventually, even if we end up bringing them in, as we often do in like September, October. Many of us are going to have a bowl full of half-ripe tomatoes on the countertop, and they will ripen. And you can put them in a bag with bananas or apples, and that will, they both release acetylene gas, which is a ripening agent, and that will boost them a little faster. Outdoors, that's not very feasible. But if we have to help our weather along a little bit, it's kind of what it is, right?
Right. Well, our fruit, I'm sorry, echoing. Oh, I don't know why. Our fruit beautifully. We're on the 2nd floor of a condo on a terrace, and boy, just full of tomatoes. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, Brian's taking care of them.
Well, you're higher too, and you know, hotter rises, so you're getting a little more warmth than somebody right down on the ground, which is great.
Yeah.
But yeah, to encourage them, you might want to invest in some attractive shower curtains.
Okay.
You know, Martha Stewart probably puts out some real good ones.
I'll check on Amazon.
There you go. No, we're boycotting Amazon. Come on.
I forgot.
Ace.
No. Oh, well.
I like Ace Hardware because it's a co-op, not a corporation.
I do love Ace,
and so the owners and the workers often have more of a share and a say in what goes on there.
Yeah, I do love Ace.
I do too.
I just send Bob out though. He has to do all that work. So. Oh gosh.
Well,
that's interesting. So you put, I've had the a plastic bag around my tomatoes now forever, and it's fallen down now onto the floor of the patio. The thing is that I tell you, when it was up, it condensed the liquid. There was water condensed on the inside a lot, and I suppose that was because it was doing its job like a greenhouse. It was
exactly.
It was really terrific. I haven't put it up recently. It's been down, but again, I have a lot of fruit. I only have 3 fruit sets so far, but I have lots of flowers. So I'm hoping.
Well, another way to do that is to get some chicken wire, and you can go in with a friend, and make a bigger hoop that you can just drop down, like a 3-foot or 4-foot chicken wire is usually about enough, and then wrap it with bubble wrap.
Oh.
Or any kind of bag, but that makes, and then you can just drop that cage over the tomatoes, or leave it there indefinitely, and that gives it good protection because really after a while those bags are constricting the plant to the size of your hoop of your cage, and if the cage isn't really all that big, it's going to lead to some possibility of foliage diseases, which better air circulation would avoid. So I think I might, step it back a little bit. And if you have a ladder, you can set up a ladder and drape a shower curtain over that, for instance, just at night, and give it a little more protection that way without having to actually confine it too much. We do have to try a little harder here. This is not Yakima. This is definitely not California. So we have to be a little more helpful with some of our vegetables. The other thing that will really help, of course, is buying regionally appropriate types to start with. And I personally mostly grow cherries, or kind of the golf ball to softball size, rather than trying to really get huge tomatoes here, because that takes special situation and special conditions.
I tell you, the slug, you were talking about slugs. I've never seen them like I have. I'm on the 3rd floor, you know, up here. I mean, they have to work to get themselves up here. Let me tell you, they're just not coming on the ground from the ground. And they're up here, and I suppose they sleep during the day in the soil. Is that correct, or in wherever?
Yeah, or under your pot. That's a popular spot. If you have a saucer, they could be under the saucer.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to bait for them is to put a little bit of bait in the saucer under the pot, or lift the saucer and put a little bit of bait under there. And that's because they usually are hiding. Sometimes they'll slip in a pot where the soil has shrunk. They'll slip down the side of the pot into the cooler area there. So but yeah, they're staying out of sight.
You're talking about Sluggo now, right?
Yes.
Writing
or
that
beer.
down.
You know, beer works really well. There were some independent studies that show that Polygirl Dark was the most favored by slugs. And it's cheap. So you can pour a little bit of Polygirl into a bunch of bottles and put them sort of nestle down at a slope into the soil so that they can slide down the top and get drunk.
They really like it. We do that.
The beard, you just put it on the ground, on the cement?
Well, I put it in the pot, resting in the pot. And you could just have a small, like, I don't know how big your pot is. I think you said it was 18 inches or something, right? So use a small jar, like a jam jar, and dig a little down so that it can rest with a bit of the base of the thing in the soil and the lip just at soil level, right? And then pour just a little beer in the bottom of it. And is that what you do, Megan? How do you bait?
Well, I actually have been saving these half yogurt containers that are about that tall, or about just circular like that. And so we dig down in the soil and put that, embed it in the garden bed. We have raised beds. So, and then pour it half full with slug beer, we call it, just cheap beer, whatever is the most not expensive, but they really do go for it. We've got to clean them out every week.
Wow.
Yeah.
We still get a couple of slugs, or snails rather, in the lettuce in particular, but it really does help quite a bit.
I haven't seen any slugs in my tomato plant. Is that right?
You might or might not, but lettuce, they've been horrible. Like, I've been really upset to open a lettuce and discover that it's full of little slugs in their gunk.
Do you know what that reminds me of? Something that I read in Old Farmer's Almanac way back when, that if you have fleas in your house, now it has nothing to do with plants, but if you have fleas in your house from whatever, you put a thing of vinegar on the floor of your house, and you have, or not vinegar, just water, a container of water about yay big, and you put a gooseneck lamp so it warms up the heat, the water that's in there, and you do that overnight, and all the fleas will come there, and you will never have fleas anymore. Wow! And it worked. It worked.
Wow. That'd be worth a try.
Yeah.
For all the fruit flies that gather around, one of the best traps you can make is sourdough starter.
Yep.
Yep. We love that. I'm always fishing them out of the top of my starter.
Oh, lovely.
Fermentation. You know, just stir them in for a little extra protein, but.
Well, I was going to say.
Carolyn, do you have any questions? I don't know if she's really there or not. Or how about you, Erica?
Sorry, I got a call.
It's okay.
Well, my daughter has she lives in close to wine country in California, and she bought a house last year, and she put pots all over the place, and her garden is just amazing. She sends pictures of them to me all the time. Just the sunshine, and of course it's dry there, so she has to water a lot, but you know, and I lived in California most of my life, so I guess that's maybe the only thing I miss besides my daughter in California. But it's the growing. But you know what? I love the cool weather.
You know, I do too. And I picked some flowers this morning to show everybody. I don't know if you can see what we got here.
Gorgeous.
Because this particular, can you see the red thing?
Poppy.
Okay, that's called a Peony Poppy.
Oh.
And they all are doubled like that. And they come in different colors, pink, white, lavender, of course. But they'll breed fairly true from seed. And that's one of my favorite kind of poppies. And you can save the seed and put them in your lemon poppy seed muffins, as far as that goes, too. And here's one of my favorite zinnias.
Oh,
Isn't that pretty?
that's pretty.
It's called Queenie Lime Orange.
Oh,
And I just love it. And I'm thinking, okay, so calendulas, you know, usually are those bright orange or yellow, but they also come in some really subtle combination colors like that.
oh.
And there's creamy ones and one called Cafe au lait, which most people think looks like something, a dog leaked on it or something, but actually it's a beautiful subtle coffee color. And then for California poppies, what did I get? Here's these.
Isn't that amazing?
Isn't that beautiful?
Oh.
You'll always get a little variation in color and form from them.
Mm-hmm.
And here, you know, if you have morning glory all over the yard, know that there are annual forms that are beautiful, like this one, that will never eat your garden or take over anything. So that's the kind I'd like to grow.
Yeah, very nice. Oh, I love walking by your place. We always.
And this is Jim again. This seems to, we've been here about 43 or 44 years, and this seems to have been one of the most lush springs that we've experienced here. And I don't understand what we attribute that to, and maybe I'm just seeing things, but it just seems that the greens were greener and deeper, and that it was a lovely spring. Wouldn't you agree?
Excuse
and
me.
now why? I'm going to ask you why.
Well, part of it's really weather related. So we had a mild winter after some very difficult winters. And then we had a spring where there was, at first it was sort of wet, and then we had a dry spell. Like April was unusually dry. And then when the rains started again, which they don't usually do, you know, this is a modified Mediterranean climate. So typically you don't get much measurable rainfall between May and October. This year, because of that skew where it was dry in April and things started to kind of slow up. And then we got quite a lot of rain in the latter part of April and well into May. That just made so many things boom. But it's been a very strange year. A lot of my friends who are plant geeks have been saying some things are a month ahead and some things are a month behind, and they can be right next to each other. So the variation in temperature is usually one of the biggest the factors in why things do well. But like this year was a boom year for rhododendrons and an incredible year for dogwoods.
Mm-hmm.
The last couple of years we've had very good, strong dogwood years. This was the best rhododendron year in many, many years.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely beautiful. That's a good explanation. Thanks.
And can I ask you a quick question?
sure.
So we have a bed of potato plants, and I never know when to pull them up. Last year, the aphids chewed off all the leaves because we didn't pull them up soon enough. And this year we pulled them up, and they're very small. They're just little new potato size. And they're great. They don't have bugs or anything, but any advice on successful potatoes?
Yeah. For one thing, our soil being acid as it is can give you problems with scab and stuff. So it's always really a good idea to start with organic potato starts from a good nursery. Or you can actually buy the organic potatoes in the grocery store and start them from that. But otherwise, potatoes, of course, are going to be treated with anti-sprouting agents, and they won't sprout for you. But I usually cut them up and let them dry on a cooling rack, or so for a couple days. And each chunk needs to have at least one eye. You probably know that part, but not everybody does. And once they're planted, I actually dig down a trench and plant them fairly deep. And you can line that trench with straw, and then start putting soil on top and alternating soil and straw. And the longer you bury them, the deeper you bury them, the more potatoes you'll get, because like tomatoes, you can bury them their stem and they'll get all those little hairs on the stems turn into roots. In the potatoes case, they turn into little potatoes. Around here, you pretty much want to make sure they get plenty of moisture during the growing season, because if they dry out, they'll brown off, the foliage will brown off early, and you won't really get mature potatoes off it. But if you keep that soil fairly moist, of course with good air circulation, not soggy, you'll get a pretty good crop. And usually the plants will bloom, and then the foliage is going to start to brown off or get yellow and get floppy. And I usually remove it and let it wait about a week maybe, and then dig them. And that gives them a chance to kind of dry out, and then dry them and cure them a little longer in a out of the sun shady place with really good air circulation. And then they'll store pretty well. But it's if you've already got potatoes, that's a little early. I would usually say even early potatoes this year, because it's been so cold, I would probably be giving them another few weeks even. And then the mid seasons I'd be looking for in another month or so. And then late potatoes more like August, even into September, depending on when you planted them. But as long as the tops are growing well, I don't usually dig them until they show signs of senescence, like they're really getting old and getting ready to sign out.
And is yellow a sign of getting old, or is that too much water?
Well, it kind of depends. This early in the season, it could be that it got more water than they want. And you could have maybe fertilize them if they get awfully yellow, or give them a little bit of chelated iron, because that sometimes yellowing can be a symptom of an iron deficiency. Especially if in our yellow clay soils. Red clay usually has pretty much iron in it, but the yellow soils, yellow sort of sandy coarse with the clay underneath, that often is kind of low in iron. So just keeping an eye on them. And those I would just dig some cottonseed meal in or something along the early on, and not be feeding them necessarily. But by the time they get to this stage and it's starting to yellow up, that's a little early. And I think I probably would give them a little boost.
With cottonseed oil and chelated iron.
Yeah, cottonseed meal, cottonseed or soy meal.
Okay.
And I like organic ones because, soy is so GMO these days. I don't want that in my garden.
Yeah. Thank you.
Someone's going to tell me that's not how it works, but I don't care. I think what we're always finding out things that people don't know or haven't figured, oh, this is perfectly safe. And then 10 years later, it's like, oh, whoops, sorry, I guess it wasn't. Right. So I like to be safe and just stay away from stuff that we don't know enough about.
Right. Brian went and bought, we had an organic potato go to sprouting. And so he went and bought one of those potato bags or something, I think at Bainbridge Gardens. That thing's going crazy.
It's
and he bought a bunch of straw.
Yeah. And you'll get a bag full. Bay Hay will sell you a bag full of loose straw for like a couple bucks, I think.
Oh, okay.
You don't need a whole bale of it, right? But
we have it now.
You'll have it for years to come.
Yes.
What do you have it in, Karen?
He bought this. It's a green bag.
Yeah.
And it's designed just for growing potatoes. And he found it at Bainbridge Gardens, I believe.
You grow the potatoes in the bag? Right.
Yeah.
And he cut up this organic potato that we had that was going, just going nuts. And it's still going nuts. And growing potatoes.
They usually have big holes on the side, Sheila, and so some of the green foliage will stick out along the way. And then you keep adding soil and straw as it grows, and then you get the whole thing full. And then the end of the season, when it dries out, you let it go dry for a little while, and the foliage will brown off. And then you just dump it on a big tarp, and you'll have a whole bunch of clean potatoes. It's pretty nice.
That sounds so incredible. Right. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so just straw from Bainbridge Gardens you got.
Or better yet, Bay Hay and feed from the loose stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Vapes does, because they sell bales of straw and hay, a lot of it's sort of loose kicking around the barn, and they realize that a lot of people don't have a need for a whole bale, and so they put it in a big bag for you, and it's really cheap. It's a couple dollars maybe.
That's good to know.
And it's funny, like I mix it into my little compost tumbler to lighten the load a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
So Anne, if your potato plants are starting to brown and yellow, then you're saying that we should pick off the foliage but leave the potatoes themselves to grow further in the garden? They won't rot, or do we not water them at that point?
You don't water them. I stop watering as soon as they start turning yellowy or browny, especially, but it also depends when you started them. This year was so slow that some of the stuff I put in early didn't get growing for quite a long time. So you stop watering when the leaves start discoloring. And when they've flopped, I cut them off and just let the potatoes sit in this dry soil for another 5 days or a week or so. Not that they'll keep growing, but that they'll kind of harden off. And then you can dig them and again dry them off a little bit more. I like to cure them in a out of the sun semi-shade situation with good air circulation. And then they'll store better. Right? I cure them on a cookie sheet. You know, what do you call those? Baker's racks that have good air circulation coming through them.
Right.
But out of the sun, of course, because you don't want them to green up, because that's toxic.